Rudolf Carnap, May 18, 1891, September 14, 1970, was a German-born philosopher who was active in Europe before 1935 and in the United States thereafter. He was a major member of the Vienna Circle and an advocate of logical positivism. He is considered one of the giants among 20th-century philosophers. Carnap's father had risen from the status of a poor ribbon weaver to become the owner of a ribbon-making factory. His mother came from academic stock, her father was an educational reformer, and her oldest brother was the archaeologist Wilhelm Dörpfeld. As a 10-year-old, Carnap accompanied his uncle on an expedition to Greece. He began his formal education at the Barmen Gymnasium. From 1910 to 1914, he attended the University of Jena, intending to write a thesis in physics. But he also studied carefully Kant's critique of pure reason during a course taught by Bruno Bauch, and was one of very few students to attend Gottlob Frege's courses in mathematical logic. While Carnap held moral and political opposition to World War I, he felt obligated to serve in the German army. After 3 years of service, he was given permission to study physics at the University of Berlin, 1917–18, where Albert Einstein was a newly appointed professor. Carnap then attended the University of Jena, where he wrote a thesis defining an axiomatic theory of space and time. The physics department said it was too philosophical, and Bruno Bauch of the philosophy department said it was pure physics. Carnap then wrote another thesis in 1921, with Bauch's supervision, on the theory of space in a more orthodox Kantian style, and published as Der Raum, Space, in a supplemental issue of Kant-Studien, 1922. In it he makes the clear distinction between formal, physical and perceptual, for example, visual, spaces. Frege's course exposed him to Bertrand Russell's work on logic and philosophy, which put a sense of the aims to his studies. He accepted the effort to surpass traditional philosophy with logical innovations that inform the sciences. He wrote a letter to Russell, who responded by copying by hand long passages from his Principia Mathematica for Carnap's benefit, as neither Carnap nor his university could afford a copy of this epical work. In 1924 and 1925, he attended seminars led by Edmund Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, and continued to write on physics from a logical positivist perspective. Carnap discovered a kindred spirit when he met Hans Reichenbach at a 1923 conference. Reichenbach introduced Carnap to Merz Schlick, a professor at the University of Vienna who offered Carnap a position in his department, which Carnap accepted in 1926. Carnap thereupon joined an informal group of Viennese intellectuals that came to be known as the Vienna Circle, directed largely by Moritz Schlick and including Hans Hahn, Friedrich Waismann, Otto Neurath, and Herbert Feigl, with occasional visits by Hans student Gert Gödel. When Wittgenstein visited Vienna, Carnap would meet with him. He, with Hahn and Neurath, wrote the 1929 Manifesto of the Circle, and, with Hans Reichenbach, initiated the philosophy journal Erkenntnis. In 1928, Carnap published 2 important books, The Logical Structure of the World, German, Der logische Aufbau der Welt, in which he developed a rigorous formal version of empiricism, defining all scientific terms in phenomenalistic terms. The formal system of the Aufbau, as the work is commonly termed, was grounded in a single primitive dyadic predicate, which is satisfied if 2 individuals resemble each other. The Aufbau was greatly influenced by Principia Mathematica, and warrants comparison with the Mariotopological metaphysics A. N. Whitehead developed over 1916–29. It appears, however, that Carnap soon became somewhat disenchanted with this book. In particular, he did not authorize an English translation until 1967. Pseudo-problems in philosophy asserted that many philosophical questions were meaningless, that is, the way they were posed amounted to an abuse of language. An operational implication of this opinion was taken to be the elimination of metaphysics from responsible human discourse. This is the statement for which Carnap was best known for many years. See also, Carnap-Ramsey sentence. In February 1930 Tarski lectured in Vienna, and during November 1930 Carnap visited Warsaw. On these occasions he learned much about Tarski's model theoretic method of semantics. Rosrand, another philosopher in the Vienna Circle, noted, Carnap's conception of semantics starts from the basis given in Tarski's work, but a distinction is made between logical and non-logical constants and between logical and factual truth. At the same time he worked with the concepts of intension and extension and took these two concepts as a basis of a new method of semantics. 4. In 1931, Carnap was appointed professor at the German Language University of Prague. There he wrote the book that was to make him the most famous logical positivist and member of the Vienna Circle, his Logical Syntax of Language, Carnap 1934. In this work, Carnap advanced his principle of tolerance, according to which there is not any such thing as a true or correct logic or language. One is free to adopt whatever form of language is useful for one's purposes. In 1933, W. V. Quine met Carnap in Prague and discussed the latter's work at some length. Thus began the lifelong mutual respect these two men shared, one that survived Quine's eventual forceful disagreements with a number of Carnap's philosophical conclusions. Carnap, whose socialist and pacifist beliefs put him at risk in Nazi Germany, immigrated to the United States in 1935 and became a naturalized citizen in 1941. Meanwhile, back in Vienna, Moritz Schlick was murdered in 1936. From 1936 to 1952, Carnap was a professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago. During the late 1930s, Carnap offered an assistant position in philosophy to Carl Gustav Hempel, who accepted. The two conducted research including logical syntax. 5. Thanks partly to Quine's help, Carnap spent the years 1939 to 41 at Harvard, where he was reunited with Tarski. Carnap, 1963. Later expressed some irritation about his time at Chicago, where he and Charles W. Morris were the only members of the department committed to the primacy of science and logic. Their Chicago colleagues included Richard McKeown, Mortimer Adler, Charles Hartshorne, and Manly Thompson. Carnap's years at Chicago were nonetheless very productive ones. He wrote books on semantics, Carnap 1942, 1943, 1956, Modal Logic, being very similar in Carnap, 1956, to the now standard possible world semantics for that logic Saul-Kripke proposed starting in 1959, and on the philosophical foundations of probability and induction, Carnap 1950, 1952. After a stint at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, he joined the philosophy department at UCLA in 1954, Hans Reichenbach having died the previous year. He had earlier refused an offer of a similar job at the University of California, because accepting that position required that he sign a loyalty oath, a practice to which he was opposed on principle. While at UCLA, he wrote on scientific knowledge, the analytic, synthetic dichotomy, and the verification principle. His writings on thermodynamics and on the foundations of probability and induction, were published posthumously as Carnap, 1971, 1977, 1980. Carnap taught himself Esperanto when he was 14 years of age, and remained sympathetic to it. Carnap 1963. He later attended the World Congress of Esperanto in 1908 and 1922, and employed the language while traveling. Carnap had 4 children by his first marriage to Elizabeth Skandub, which ended in divorce in 1929. He married his second wife, Elizabeth Ina Stogner, in 1933. Ina committed suicide in 1964.